there was a report that 16 Chinese military cargo planes had landed in Iran over that course of that day. That became to me that Trump had no choice but to hit Iran then and there. Russia is one of the few countries that's benefiting. Maybe to some extent, some other non-OPEC producer like Norway and Canada also benefiting from higher prices, but there's no doubt Russia needs that money more than anything else. But the three options that he has available to him all involve a lot of risk. By the way, the best performing stock market last week was the Chinese stock market. The best performing currency in the world last week was the RMB. For China, this war has not cost China anything, because Iran going to a civil war will reduce Iran's value as an asset for China. I've said from the get-go, at least as far as my clients are concerned, which is that this war is going to be a lot messier than people think.
Welcome to another episode of You Decide podcast. My guest today is David Wu. He's an American economist and an investment strategist with a focus on the intersections between economics, politics, geopolitics, and financial markets. In 2013, Business Insider included Wu on its list of Wall Street's 12 smartest people. Amongst David's legendary predictions that came true is his forecast in 2015 that China would devalue its currency. In September 2016, Wu forecast that Donald Trump would win the US presidential election and that a victory would result in higher US Treasury yields and a stronger dollar. Again, predictions that were correct. Hello, David. Thanks for coming on my podcast. What time is it there at the moment where you are?
Right now, it's 11 minutes past 10 in the evening.
Okay. So we'll try to keep it brief. Thanks for coming on the podcast again.
Thanks for having me.
In the introduction that I gave, I listed a few of your predictions that have come true before. But also, there was another prediction that came true. We were talking to each other before the war on Iran started. And you were predicting that the attack would happen before mid-March. Why were you so confident? What were the factors that you thought there's definitely going to be some sort of attack happening?
Yeah, there were two reasons. I think, first of all, believe it or not, it was the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court to rule against Trump's tariff. That was the first sign to me that, a strike on Iran was coming. Because you understand, right? As we all know, this year we've got a, midterm election coming up in the U.S. in November, and right now the Republicans are trailing the Democrats in a poll, at least, in terms of the House race. It looks like the Republicans are going to get wiped out. Okay. Now, at the start of the year, it was thought that Trump was going to throw the kitchen sink at the economy to actually put his party in a competitive position. And in order to throw the kitchen sink at the economy, he was hoping to send every American, a $2,000, tariff rebate to get the economy going just before the midterm. Okay. Now, guess what? Once the Supreme Court ruled against the legality of the tariff, it became very clear that that was no longer an option, to the extent that there was no stimulus that Trump can do that he can get through Congress that can help essentially reverse what is looking like a pretty, bad situation ahead of the midterm election. Therefore, I thought if the midterm election was no longer in play, to the extent that Trump was starting to think that it was not going to happen for the Republicans, then he had nothing to lose by going after Iran. Because going after Iran was always going to bring about a spike in oil price. That much I know, Trump knew, everybody knew. Okay, so that so from that point of view, only after the Supreme Court's ruling, became very clear that Trump no longer had anything to lose, and therefore he could go ahead and basically order a strike on Iran, regardless what it means for oil price. I think that's the first part. The second reason why I became very, very convinced that a U.S. strike on Iran was coming was because China had thrown down the gauntlet sometime in early February, at least as far as Iran was concerned. Now, as you may know, the Iran-China Railroad, which has been under construction for the last 10 years, which runs 10,000 kilometers long, is almost fully operational. Once it becomes fully operational, not only it will cut the delivery time of Iranian oil to China from 45 days by sea to just 15 days by rail. But most importantly, it will render U.S. sanctions on Iranian oil exports completely ineffective. Okay. And I think from that point of view, to me, the window was closing rapidly for the U.S. to do something with Iran before Iran sort of like reaches escape velocity, if you like. Okay. Once it's the economic integration between China and Iran essentially reaches a new level that but most importantly was this, because even until 2 months ago, China was very reluctant to provide Iran with a strategic backstop. It was not until after, Trump's unilateral actions against Venezuela that China reassessed, the stance. And I think from that point of view, when the day that Trump landed in Davos at the World Economic Forum, I don't know if you remember, in early February, there was a report that 16 Chinese military cargo planes had landed in Iran, basically over that course of that day. That became to me that Trump had no choice but to hit Iran then and there. Because it was a clear sign, because as far as I'm concerned, this war, in Iran is the first proxy war ever between the United States and China. Once China, decided to provide Iran with air defense, with money to stabilize the currency, with other things, it became very clear that Iran no longer had any incentive to back down. That, if you recall, it was a very different situation, last June, when the Iranians were begging for help from the Chinese and from the Russians, and none was forthcoming. This time it's a very, very different situation. So once China became heavily involved in Iran over the past 2 months, it became clear to me that Iran was not going to negotiate. Now you can see Iranians just heard me say this, and then my alert just basically went off. But let's keep going, because I've still 5 minutes. We don't know if this first alert, is going to be actually lead to a siren, which we'll only know in 5 minutes, but I'll let you know. But the point here is that once China became involved, not only Iran became much more dug in because they thought that they had backing, from Beijing, but that the U.S. decided then and there that they had no choice but to go hit Iran, because they did not want to allow Iran and China to further cement their relationship, which would have basically essentially undercut the U.S. influence in the region. So I think from that point of view, the Supreme Court decision to rule against Trump's tariff made it, let's put it this way, reduce any political price to Trump for hitting Iran there in the middle of a midterm election year. But once China became involved, Iran was no longer just some regional conflict. It is about the strategic competition between U.S. and China. And then at that point, Trump, even people around Trump, had to fall in, including isolationists like J.D. Vance.
I was actually going to say this a bit later, that because I introduced you as an American economist, but I was going to say later that you're married to an Israeli and you're actually living in Israel right now, and that was the siren that the Iranian missiles presumably are coming. So I'm going to be really quick, and if you need to go, please tell me that you need to go, and I don't want to hold you back, obviously. So how much of China's oil comes from Iran, and how much of it comes from the Straits of Hormuz?
I mean, it's just not that much. It's about 15%. But I think but Iran is much more important to China than just 15% of its oil imports. Let's remember, Iran is arguably the single most important strategic hub in China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? What is the Belt and Road Initiative? Because, I think a lot of people don't even understand what it really is. What it is about building a land bridge, from China to the Middle East onto Africa. Now, why a land bridge? It's very simple. Land bridge so that China has a way to counter any attempt on the part of the U.S. in the future to impose essentially a maritime embargo on China's oil imports or imports of other resources from Africa or elsewhere. Because let's remember, why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor at the start of the Second World War?
Because of oil, wasn't it?
Because the US, 5 days earlier, Roosevelt had imposed a total oil embargo on Japan, which would have essentially paralyzed the Japanese economy, would have basically forced Japan onto its knees. So the Japanese decided to attack Pearl Harbor to strike at the US Pacific Fleet so that they get a chance to go after, Indonesia and Malaysia where there was oil, so that they became self-sufficient, at least from the point of Asia. This is the reason why they gamble. China knows that very well. They know that the US tomorrow can potentially shut off China's access to oil and other resources, so as to put a stranglehold on the Chinese economy. That's why the only way they can get around that, except besides building a massive, naval fleet that can rival that of the US, which will be expensive, is to, of course, build a land route, okay, through to the Middle East. And in Iran, from that point of view, is very, very important. It's simply, Iran is about, allowing China to get around any potential maritime choke points that the US imposes on China in future conflict. So from that point of view, this is what I'm saying to you. If Iran is gone, then China will be even more dependent on oil from, let's just say, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, that has to travel through the Gulf, basically the Gulf of Malacca, which the U.S. can literally stop tomorrow. And this is also the reason why China is busy trying to, increase its grasp of the South China Sea, where all this happens. So again, that's what I'm saying to you, that in the end, this war in Iran, ultimately it's about the great rivalry between the U.S. and China. And this is also the reason why this war today being fought is completely different than why this war was being fought last year, last June. It was a completely different thing. And the stakes are so much higher. And I think this is something a lot of people don't quite understand, but because China has been very reluctant to sort of play an overt role in this war, to the extent that they're not going to be sending troops into this war for lots of different reasons. But I think it's the role that China is playing behind the scene that actually has, basically that has leave a lot at stake here.
And right now, we can see some signs that Russia is benefiting from this war as well, isn't it? Because part of the sanctions on the Russian oil have been suspended because the West needs the oil. What is the oil situation at the moment with the prices, and how long before it can become a crisis?
Well, I think first of all, for Russia, this was like, this war could not have come at a better time, because as you know, after 4 years of this war in Ukraine, with oil prices, falling year after year, since the war, the Russian financial situation has definitely deteriorated dramatically. I would say 4 years ago, Russia was when they embarked on this war, Russia was an incredibly strong and healthy economic situation that in many ways that under Putin, Russia has been very cautious. in terms of the economic policy that Russia had pursued. They ran very small current account, they ran a current account surplus, they run a small current, basically budget deficit. So, from a balance sheet perspective, Russia was in a very good place. But obviously, after 4 years of war, which has been very expensive, the Russian situation was looking increasingly precarious. So from that point of view, to the extent that all of a sudden oil prices shot up from $60 to now $100, and then the Russians have been given this, temporary waiver to export their oil, at least, to India. I think, there's no doubt that this is this relief could not have come any sooner for Russia. And by the way, in this respect, Russia is one of the few countries that's benefiting. Maybe to some extent, some other non-OPEC producer like Norway and Canada also benefiting from higher prices, but there's no doubt Russia needs that money more than anything else. Now, in terms of where and when, this high energy price is going to have an effect on the global economy, I think what is interesting to me, and it says so much about what Wall Street really thinks about this war is the fact that the U.S. economy, the U.S. stock market, has been incredibly resilient, right? The stock market traded to all-time high. Even with this war, with oil price having shot up to $100 a barrel, the U.S. stock market is still not that far from its all-time high. It's come down, but barely so. The question is why? The reason is because, there is a very strong consensus on Wall Street, rightly or wrongly, I think it's wrong, that this war is going to be very short. And the reason is because everybody's convinced that either Trump is going to chicken out, meaning that he's going to tackle like he's done on so many different occasions in the past, or that Iran is going to run out of missiles or resources and will simply, give up its resistance. So it's actually interesting to me because there is a whole continuum of potential outcome as far as this war is concerned. Wall Street latches onto the two sort of outliers in this continuum and essentially said they're the most likely scenario, even though I think the market is likely to be proved seriously wrong, because I think I've said from the get-go, at least as far as my clients are concerned, which is that this war is going to be a lot messier than people think. And I think the market is only slowly coming around to that realization. But that remains my baseline scenario.
Yeah, and reading the Iran state's news media, the message that they're giving is that in the previous 12-day war, they shouldn't have agreed to a ceasefire so quickly. No. And they seem to think that the longer the war goes on, the more it will be to their benefit. And they keep saying that this time we will decide when the war will end. But of course, like you said, it's a case of whether they will they've got enough resources to continue the war, and if they've got the economy to continue the war, if they've got enough missiles and drones to continue the war. But when you said like this war is going to get a lot messier, in some ways, in the last few days, there's been a new front that's opened up, and that's the attack on the banking sector. So the Americans and the Israelis, they've carried out massive cyber attacks on one of the Iranian banks, the Bank Melli, and there's been serious disruptions in the services. People who had accounts with Bank Melli haven't been able to use it. More important than that is Bank Sepa, because that seems to have been bombed, and the database and the server is destroyed. And apparently they didn't have a backup server, so they can't even restore their database. And that bank pays the salary of Iran's armed forces. And we've got the Iranian New Year coming up on 20th of March. And imagine it's like as if like you can't pay your armed forces for Christmas. Could that sort of like, do you think, cause some defections in the IRGC ranks? And also, Iran has retaliated against the banking sector in the West. So they hit the Dubai Financial Center a few days ago. They hit there was some unknown Islamist group that carried out an explosion in the Amsterdam financial district. How messy is this going to get, and how robust is the Western banking system against these sort of attacks?
Right. I think what's happening in terms of trading fire over each other's banks is just one part of the overall strategy between the two sides. Because what is the overall strategy, right? I mean, I teach game theory here in Israel. I'm a professor at Rajkam University. And, for me, what's interesting here is that, Iran understands that, the bar for Iran to win this war is much lower than that of the U.S., right? If Iran knows if the regime can survive, at the end of this war, Iran can declare victory, right? That's number one. Whereas for the U.S., guess what? Unless Trump can actually at this point affect the regime change, it'll be very difficult for him to declare victory. And we can talk about, maybe some of the other ways, but there's no easy way for Trump to declare victory at this point, And at the same time, Iran knows that Trump, given his behavior of the past year, that Trump's pain threshold is very low, If the stock market goes down 10%, that's it. Trump's going to call it quits, right? I mean, there is the one thing that has massive impact. I mean, Trump can say, screw everybody, I don't care, I'm my own boss, I make my own mind. But the only thing that can hold Trump ransom is the U.S. stock market. Okay. Therefore, as a result, Iran knows they can win this war by driving oil price to the roof in order to pressure the U.S. stock market. They believe that if the U.S. stock market goes down 10%, Trump is going to say, okay, that's it. I'm getting out now. So that is, and then you could argue that, as far as the stock market is concerned, sure, we're 2 weeks into this war, oil price is $100 for 1 week only. If it stays up there for more than 3 weeks, that's it. So therefore, Iran is banking on Trump not being able to keep this going for more than 3 weeks. So therefore, all Iran has to do is to keep going for 3 weeks. I don't think Iran needs to be able to keep going for 3 months, let alone 3 years. If they can keep this up for 3 to 4 weeks, okay, they might just be able to force Trump to toggle. Now, this is also the reason why, I can tell you, in Israel, right? Most Israelis would tell you that, we've had it easy this time, right? That, last time, by now, okay, 12 days into the war, 10,000 Israelis have been left homeless. This time, there isn't that much destruction going on. Like last time, many more people already died. This time, I think about 11, 12 people have died so far, okay, from the Iranian bombing. Okay. And let me tell you, this is not because Iran somehow is running out of missiles, that what Trump would like you to believe. In my view, the reason why they're firing fewer missiles at Israel this time around is because Israel is certain, by hitting Israel is not going to help Iran win the fight. Because the only way for Iran to win the fight is by pushing oil price higher. Hitting Israel is not going to push oil price higher. Hitting Israel is just going to be wasting their missiles. This is the reason why, in my humble opinion, Iran has not been unleashing their missiles at Israel. Yeah, recently they have been firing a few more missiles than they did last week, but only because Hezbollah is now involved. And then the Iranians want to, show Hezbollah that actually, you have our back, we have your back as well. So in my view, the lobbing of missiles by Iran to Israel has been very symbolic. It was more for a show for the Hezbollah than for really trying to do any serious damage to Israel. Because again, the focus is on oil, which is about destabilizing, stopping the tanker traffic in the Strait of Hormuz, essentially crippling the oil fields of UAE and basically Saudi Arabia, shutting down the banks in UAE, okay, which is obviously important for the oil export and so on and so forth. So the whole point, this is why I think, if you ask me, like a lot of, Western commentators want you to believe that Iran is, flat on his knees, that the whole entire leadership has been taken out, nobody's making decisions, that kind of thing. If you ask me, okay, again, only basing my assessment on, on what actually has happened, not based on what has been said, but actually what's happened, I would say everything Iran has done in the last 2 weeks is consistent with the idea that the leadership is in full control. On top of that, all I know is this, all people have been talking about in the last 48 hours in Israel is the fact that Khamenei's son has not been seen in public for the last 3 months. What does that say? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that wouldn't have gotten out. People wouldn't be talking about this if it didn't come from somewhere, most likely from the Mossad, right? So the guy has not been seen for 3 months. He certainly was not at this meeting, this gathering of senior officials, on the first day of the war when they all got killed, including Larry Johnny wasn't there either. What it says to me, I don't know if you'd agree, is that Plan B already was in motion.
Plan B is what?
Plan B, in other words, that Khamenei thought that he could be taken out in an assassination attempt, his leadership, and so on and so forth. So they had already gone to Plan B to the extent that if Plan A got taken out, Plan B was already in motion. It didn't start the day after Plan A basically got, essentially blown out of the water. I'm saying this is the reason why Larry Johnny was not at this meeting, Khamenei's son was not at this meeting, because they were already taking precaution to making sure that the second string was not in the same place with the first string.
But how confident can we be about this Plan B, David? Because I mean, you have to admit there's something strange about this, that since the son has been appointed as the new leader, we haven't even had an audio file. Now, I don't expect him to do a live interview on state TV or speak to to his audience or something, but at least when they gave his first message on the state TV, all they showed was a picture of him with the presenter reading a text. I mean, surely that is strange. Something's going on. He cannot be available. So
I,
is
I,
Plan B
I
really
disagree.
working?
I disagree because I'll tell you why. Because first of all, the fact that Khamenei got taken out so easily. I mean, not to mention what happened last year during the 12-day war, the ease with which Israel was able to wipe out so many of the top echelon of the military. It's because clearly Israel has a lot of inside help, right? There are clearly collaborators from the inside who's feeding information to the Israelis, the Americans, so on and so forth. I think Khamenei's son is not going to take his chance with that, right? Because whenever you're going to make it go
Even a
public,
pre-recorded audio file?
listen, I don't even think that's necessary. I think clearly, listen, at the end of the day, and it doesn't really matter. Who knows? He may be dead, he may not be dead, whatever it is he disfigured? Do I really believe that? All of a sudden they're so convinced that he's disfigured, that his leg has been blown to pieces. How can anybody know? I don't even understand how they. So what I'm saying is that there's a lot of propaganda going on. Both sides are trying to essentially trying to basically create this fog of war to make it impossible. But again, this is why I rather judge based on action rather than words. If I look at the way, for example, the measured response of Iran against Israel, to me, that has to be a very calculated, essentially, response. The fact that they're focusing the energy on closing the Strait of Hormuz, again, shows that actually that is what they should be doing if they want to win. The fact that they're focusing all the energy on that tells me that they're not being emotional, that they're actually very strategic the way they're going about trying to win this war. And I think, I thought it's amazing. I mean, you heard what Larry Johnny said and what the RGC said last week. It was like, well, Larry Johnny said that, that Trump tried to reach out to the Iranians through the Omani, whatever, mediators, and to suggest, a negotiated ceasefire. Larry Johnny said we will only negotiate if the state of Israel no longer exists. The IRGC said if you want us to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, you got to drop all sanctions on Iran, just as a starting point. Okay. What I'm saying to you is that Iran can smell, okay, Trump is not doing well, that he's under pressure to basically walk away, okay? But Iran is going to make Trump pace through the nose, okay, to offer him an offering. And this is where it gets very interesting because I think, from that point of view, I just think that it just seems to me, okay, there is no reason. Again, we got to basically judge according to the results so far. The fact is that, 4 out of the 8 THAAD radars that the Americans have in the Middle East have been destroyed by the Iranians. Clearly, they're very good at that. Okay. So far, to me, this is actually what is most interesting, which is that actually a lot of what Iran has done, actually, to me, is actually shows that they've learned a thing or two from the mistakes last year, and also they have help from the Chinese. I think there is no doubt about that. Okay, and I think this is why it's going to be messy. And I'll tell you why it's going to be messy. Because I've always said, given the kind of person Trump is, he will only tackle if he's ahead in this war. Okay, he could have tackled a day into the war, saying, "Oh well, we just decapitated Khamenei and Nassine, whatever, declare victory and get out." Okay, he could have still tackled a week into the war, but now that Iran is pulling ahead, Trump cannot get out without essentially looking like it was a defeat. Okay. Now, and then if he's defeated, the consequences for the Middle East, for his legacy, is going to be catastrophic, by the way. Catastrophic. Now, this is the reason why I say at this point, Trump needs to regain the momentum in this war in order to spin it as, a victory that will allow him to basically get out, with a face-saving basically off-ramp. But the three options that he has available to him all involve a lot of risk. One, of course, is he will have to basically, to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, he will have to basically take over the shoreline Iranian shoreline around Bandar Abbas. Now, we all know that the Iranians have been preparing for this for the last few years. And what makes it very tricky is the fact that the Bandar Abbas, the whole shoreline, is very narrow. The plain, the coastal plain is very narrow, which means that the U.S. cannot, basically a massive amount of basically military there because it's very, very narrow. At the same time, the shoreline that meets, a very mountainous, rugged area where Iranians enjoy, natural defenses. On top of that, they have a vantage point an elevated vantage point that could actually allow them to hit any basically amphibian assaults, directly on the beach and so on and so forth. It will basically cause tremendous casualty on the part of the U.S. if they were to even try. But I wouldn't say that they won't try because the Marines obviously are being sent there for a reason. The second thing that Trump can do to regain the momentum is, of course, making a grab for the enriched uranium stockpile. Right. I mean, the CNN basically talked about the story last week that, you send in a few hundred Marines together with special operation units into like a place like, Isfahan. And then to trying to secure the enriched uranium and get it out so that Trump can say, oh, wow, I got this now. I took it away from the Iranians. But of course, we all know Iranian forces are already they're already waiting there to ambush the Americans. The Isfahan, nuclear facility, as we all know, it doesn't have this ventilation shafts that the U.S. can drop a bunker buster bomb, essentially blow up the underground tunnels. This is why they have to go in with actually special forces if they want to basically get to the enriched uranium. But forget about the fact that the underground chambers where the Iranians likely kept is like 100 basically meters deep. But the access tunnels are very long. So it's not like you can take an elevator, you go right down to the chamber. I have to believe at this point, Iran has booby-trapped all the tunnels. They're going to basically blow it up as soon as the Americans get in there. You think this is going to be a walk in the park? It's going to be tough, But it's interesting that they're even talking about this, the Americans, right? The third thing, of course, Trump can do is to call on the Iranian people to rise up to overthrow the regime.
Which they're doing.
Yeah, but in order to do that, so that you just don't send people to the early graves, you got to soften what I call the infrastructure of oppression, right? That is the police, the Basij, But we all know, Israel has been targeting the headquarters of the police, the Basij, over the last basically week.
And even the stop and checkpoints on the streets.
Exactly.
So it's quite clear that they're enticing the people to come on the streets again. They're saying that the balance of power is tipped in your favor. You can now come out and overthrow the regime.
Exactly. But the only thing is, as you and I know, the Basij is a very decentralized organization. These guys are volunteers. They're embedded. They're not sitting in a headquarter office smoking cigarettes. These people are embedded in mosques, in schools, in hospitals, in government offices, in private offices. They are not going around in uniform. By now, they're probably wearing civilian clothes. Also, the Basij, just like Hamas and Gaza, have built up this massive underground tunnel system. And so from that point of view, precisely because they were thinking maybe this day would come. So I just know that in the last 2 years, Israeli Air Force was largely, unsuccessful in terms of dealing with these tunnels from the air. In the end, you had to send in ground troops, and to flush out people off from the tunnels. I don't think it's going to be that easy. My only point here is this. I think, I think the Iranian, I don't think it will be that easy. I think right now, the important thing is that Iran, it's interesting. As you know, Iran today is exporting more oil than it did before the war. Right?
Wow.
Oh, it's very simple. Because you know what? You say, okay, fine. You know, it's funny because Trump says, oh, well, yeah, they went to basically hit the Karg Island, right? That is basically, it's the port and the oil
The oil
terminal.
refineries are.
90% of the Iranian oil exports happen from the. But guess what? The Pentagon went out of his way, okay, on Sunday to say that they hit only the military sites, but not the oil infrastructure. Now, the reason is very simple, because if you go ahead Iran's oil infrastructure, oil price will go up even more because Iran right now is exporting 2.5 million barrels per day. If you take that away from the market, oil price is going to come another 30%. If the Americans really wanted to stop Iranian oil export, you know what? All they have to do is just start basically destroying essentially all the Iranian tankers. They haven't done that. They haven't done that because Trump doesn't want to see oil price higher. That is the point. And Iran knows this is why they are holding Trump by the balls. And this is why Trump made a huge mistake, in my humble opinion, last week when he said, oh, well, listen, that the war is very complete. It's going to be over very soon. When Iran heard that, they knew that Trump has got the weak hand, not the strong hand. And by the way, if you need more evidence of this, yesterday the Wall Street Journal published a big article that clearly was based on a leak from inside the Pentagon, saying that the Pentagon had briefed Trump about essentially the closing of Hormuz as being for sure is going to happen if the U.S. were to strike Iran. And they said that Trump's answer, okay, was that don't worry, okay, I have no doubt that Iran is going to capitulate before they close the Strait of Hormuz. So Trump decided to go ahead and hit Iran anyway. So the fact that Pentagon is already trying to distance itself from Trump's decision to go to war with Iran is a very clear indication that maybe things are not going that well. And they want to make sure if Trump is going to go down, basically, essentially going down in flame, that they don't want to basically be there with him. So it's actually very, very interesting what's going on. So I don't think it's going that well. I mean, listen, and yet I want this war to go well for the U.S. I live in Israel. I want this regime to be replaced. But I also know is that, again, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the things, in general, I just don't see this regime literally like flat on its, belly and it's about to collapse. There is no sense of that being imminent. Okay.
This is why I like talking to you.
The reality is quite the contrary. Yes.
This is why I like talking to you, because you don't think with your heart. You think with facts and figures. And it's these facts and figures that you manage to get from places that always interest me. Now, there are several outcomes, as we talked about. One of them is an uprising by the people. And by the way, as we're speaking today, tomorrow is the last Tuesday in the Iranian year, which is the fireworks night. And traditionally, the fireworks night has always been a night of protest because it's something pre-Islamic. The regime generally doesn't like it because it's pre-Islamic, and people love the fireworks night, so they try to defy the regime's orders. And now it's got another special weight to it. But another possible outcome is China could get to a stage where saying, okay, like this is enough. And China could talk Iran out of continuing the war. How much is China suffering from the war at the moment? Or at what point could it be too much cost for China to continue with the war as well?
Like for China, I mean, so far, like, by the way, the best performing stock market last week was the Chinese stock market. The best performing currency in the world last week was the RMB. China, actually, for China, like this war has not cost China anything. Like they probably had to send some stuff like aids to Iran and so on and so forth, in exchange for promises on the part of Iran to give China mining rights down the road, who knows, whatever it is. But the point here is that so far, I mean, in fact, actually, the reason why the Chinese stock market is doing so well is because, as you know, China is the leader in electric vehicles. So whereas, American car companies have taken a huge hit because they're like gas, basically guzzling cars. Chinese cars, are seen as being beneficiaries of higher oil price because they don't use oil. So what I'm saying to you, I don't think this whole argument that China is going to put an end to this, I think is unconvincing. Also because I think from China's standpoint, especially given, how the war is going so far, like China wouldn't mind seeing, the US, essentially being weakened all this, right? China, so I think from that point of view, if you think about this in terms of the great rivalry between China and the US, I think China has no reason to all of a sudden want to help the US to bring this war to an end, unless Trump can offer China something that China can actually turn down. But such as Taiwan, but that's never going to happen. So I think this is why, yeah.
I mean, I think I heard that Trump's actually gone to China today. Is that right? Did I hear it right? Or?
It's interesting because Trump actually said today that he may delay his trip to China because actually that, again, I think nobody wants to acknowledge, the role that China may be playing inside Iran. Okay. But I think the fact that Trump is hinting that he may delay his trip to China is probably, as explicit acknowledgement you're going to get from Washington that they think China is playing a role, and therefore there was no point for him to go to China to talk to China, Xi Jinping, while he's fighting a war that China is basically is backing, at least to some extent. So I think, and also tells you that, there's no point going to China because he knows that China is does not have an incentive to help Trump bring an end to the war in Iran. So what is there to talk about? So, because this war is everything for Trump. Just think about this. Trump is already a lame duck president, right? Because typically a two-term U.S. president becomes a lame duck after the midterm election of his second term, okay? But after the Supreme Court having ruled against the signature policy of his administration, which is tariff, Trump is already a lame duck. And I can tell you, if you go back to the last 50 years, you can, one pattern that is, that's very clear is that when a president becomes a lame duck, his focus shifts away from politics to legacy, especially to foreign policy legacy. This was true in the case of Richard Nixon. Okay. This was true with Clinton. Definitely was very true about Obama. Now, for Trump, the single biggest and most important legacy as far as he's concerned, at least in the realm of foreign policy, is of course Iran. If you remember, like in his first term, he walked away from the Obama nuclear agreement. He imposed massive sanctions on Iran. And then he hit Iran, last June, to destroy its nuclear capabilities and so on and so forth. Now he's doing this again. If Trump walks away from Iran, just think about this for a second. If Trump now walks away from Iran without getting the job done, future historians are going to think that he's a total fool. Okay? Because if he did that, it will be literally like handing Iran over to China. Okay? It would mean that, in the future, like oil sanctions against Iran will no longer work. It would mean that Iran, after having been able to, hit UAE, Saudi Arabia with relative impunity, all these Sunni countries would then have to kowtow to basically Iran. Okay, the whole region and Israel is going to be completely isolated because after that, Saudi Arabia will have no incentive whatsoever to cooperate with Israel because Iran is right there. So I just think that, at this point, that's what we have to understand. What is at stake here? Trump is a very vain person, but that's okay because vanity means that he is obsessed with his legacy. And at this point, if he actually ends up getting out without getting the job done, his legacy will be in complete tatters, in my view.
Now, just one last question, David, and I'm really conscious about what's happening over there and that you might get another alarm that you have to go to do you go to the shelter when you get the alarm?
I have a huge shelter, actually, just underneath my house. I have a nuclear shelter, believe it or not.
Okay. Right. One other possible outcome is we've been hearing talks about the Kurdish opposition groups crossing over the border. The west, that part of Iran, the west part of Iran, the Kurdish region, has been bombed extensively, even more than the other places. I mean, there is not a police station standing there. There's no IRGC base. There's no Basij base. There's no intelligence ministry bases. Everything there has been bombed. And I keep hearing that, the border posts have gone as well. And it's actually quite clear for the Kurdish opposition groups to come over. Now, if that happens, it could mean that Iran could be divided into several conclaves with different opposition groups, ethnic groups, taking over that region. And that would engulf Iran into some sort of internal war, which will sort of like deplete its resources and its ability to fight. In fact, recently, 6 Kurdish opposition groups declared a coalition. They put aside their differences. And there was a lot of talk about these opposition groups, which have experienced fighters, Peshmergas, with expertise in urban guerrilla warfare and weapons, to cross over and at least take over a part of Iran. Now, I mean, I don't think their appeal will only be limited to the ethnic regions that they're from. It's not going to appeal to the rest of Iran. But there is a possibility, isn't it? As much as I don't like thinking about it, but there is a possibility that Iran could disintegrate and there could be different conclaves and some sort of civil war that would engage Iran. How likely do you think that is to happen for the Kurdish groups to come over and take over that region?
Sure. The first interesting thing was, if you remember, Trump remarked last week that he changed his mind about the Kurds. At one point, they were clearly trying to get the Kurds to go into Iran and trying to, whatever, and then he changed his mind. Why is that all of a sudden? One reason could very well be the objection of Turkey. We know the Turks, that's the last thing the Turks wanted to see. And the Turks might have threatened the Americans with jumping to the war themselves if the U.S. were to, essentially trying to, start arming the Kurds, right? Because this would involve arming the Kurds and giving them money. And then once the Kurds have the money and the arms, they might decide to either go west or go east. You have no idea, right? So I think the Kurds only now, and only 3 months ago, as 6 months ago, that that the whole Kurdish issue has been dealt with, right, in Syria, okay, with the Turks having talked the Americans into betraying the Kurds, okay? And I think, from that point of view, I'm going to assume that, the Americans don't want the Turks to get involved any more than they already have. And therefore, I think, all of a sudden the Kurdish option looks less attractive. The second thing is that the Kurds have just been sold by Donald J. Trump. Just think about this. The Kurds were fighting for the Americans in Syria. They were fighting, ISIS. They did the Americans essentially beckoning. And guess what? The U.S. just flushed them down the toilet and said, screw you, you're on your own. So will the Kurds, the Kurds are not totally stupid. Do they want to be used by the Americans the same way once again and to be tossed aside as their garbage, right? I think that's a very important consideration. So I don't know. I don't know if the Kurds will play a huge role. Obviously, in Iran, the Kurds represent a fairly large minority, right? 12% or something like that of the population. So obviously they will have a say in whatever happens down the road. But I tend to share your view, okay, that, if we were to get a regime change in Iran, okay, it's less likely we're going to get a smooth transition to democracy. More likely we're going to see a transition to civil war and warlords. That all of the heads of the IGRC, they're going to retreat back to their own provinces. And all of a sudden, every province, you're going to have a little warlord seizing the strategic assets and start to operate on its own. Okay? And that, to me, is probably more likely. But you know what, Popkin? This is the sad reality about American foreign policy. The Americans, from the American standpoint, there's probably not a huge difference between, Iran becoming a democracy or Iran going to a civil war. Because Iran going to a civil war will reduce Iran's value as an asset for China. If this war is about reducing the strategic value of Iran that for China, then you know what? As long that will do it. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, because
This is why it would be a mistake to think that the Americans are doing this because they are a champion of democracy in Iran. I mean, let's put it this way: when the Americans took out Maduro from Venezuela, the last thing Trump had in mind was promoting democracy. I mean, he didn't even pretend that this was a goal at all. So, the Americans just want to win, and they want to win against China. If that means destroying Iran in the process, I don't even think that they will bat an eyelash. That's the sad irony, but that's the reality that I think we have to accept.
Yeah, because for the Road and Belt Initiative, stability is one big factor to it, isn't it? The Chinese want stable regimes where to extend their Road and Belt project. So yeah, I mean, it's depressing notes, but it's very realistic, I think, sadly. And I think you probably agree with me. And on that note, I'd like to thank you again for coming on the podcast and sharing all your knowledge and your facts and figures with me. As I said, tomorrow is the fireworks night. We'll have to see whether that translates into any further uprising in Iran and what the situation is. But you do agree with me that war is unpredictable and things can change overnight, and there are always so many unknown factors that come into it.
I think it's true, but you could still some scenarios are more likely than others. Such as, I think today, if I have to look at the facts today on the ground and everything, I think Trump is less likely to taco than he's to taco. And as I said before, if he needs a face-having off-ramp, he'll have to take more risk. And more risk means that things might get uglier before it ends. That much I know. I think things are going to get uglier before this war ends. I don't think the world is quite prepared for it. And then once things get ugly, things also get out of control. And we've seen this in many wars, that all of a sudden starts as a small regional conflict, and next thing you know, becomes a world war. So I think, this is one of these situations. I don't know how it's going to go, but all I know is that, that Trump now the stakes are high. Trump now has to take more risk, and because he's underestimated Iran. And then by taking more risk, that means the situation becomes less predictable. Okay. And the situation, yeah, I think, this is what makes it very scary for me.
Thanks, David, and I wish you a safe night. And hopefully, you can spare me some more time in the future, and we can come back to this and talk more about as the situation develops. I'm really grateful for your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.